was 1998. Bill Clinton was president, the date September 11th meant nothing to anyone, and Iraq was just some foreign country to the average Joe. Me, I didn't know much about any of that. I was 8 years old at the time. That year, I was attending a new elementary school, and there was only one thing on the mind of every kid on that school bus. Something I had, at that point, only barely even heard of. Little did I know what awaited me in the wonderful world of Pokemon. Just to get this out of the way right off the bat, my favorite Pokemon is Blastoise, my favorite legendary is Mewtwo, and my favorite generations are Gen 1 and Gen 4. Now moving on. Pokemon began as the brainchild of one Satoshi Tajiri. As a child in Japan, Tajiri was an avid bug collector, as at the time, his home in Tokyo still had a very rural atmosphere. He loved it so much that he was often called Dr. Bug by the other kids, and even considered a career in etymology. However, during his teen years, Tajiri would discover arcade games, a passion that would come to rival even bug collecting. At 17, Tajiri began writing for a publication called Game Freak, which at the time was handwritten and stapled together. During this time, he met Ken Sugimori, and the two took steps to create their own games for the Nintendo platform. Meanwhile, Nintendo was trying to get its new Game Boy handheld console off the ground. It was not going well. The system was big, awkward, and despite its immense battery life, was just not competing as effectively against the handhelds that were in full color. No one would have called the writer of a handmade magazine stepping in to save a failing system, but that's exactly what happened. As he was growing older, Tajiri noticed the urbanization that was sweeping through his home. Different kind of insects were becoming fewer and fewer, and more children were spending their free time indoors playing video games. When he saw the Game Boy with its link cable system, Tajiri was struck with a bolt of inspiration. He imagined a game where children would collect digital bugs, like the real ones he did as a kid, and trade them over link cable to their friends. Tajiri pitched the idea to Nintendo in the early 90s. They didn't quite understand the concept, but felt confident enough to tell Tajiri to move forward under the guidance of the man himself, Shigeru Miyamoto. If you don't know who Miyamoto is, then who are you and how did you find this site? Well, okay, maybe that's a little unfair. Basically, Shigeru Miyamoto is one of the driving forces behind basically all of the highly successful franchises in the Nintendo market. He created Mario, Legend of Zelda, Pikmin, Donkey Kong, Star Fox, just to name a few. Basically, if you throw in a copy of Super Smash Bros., you're selecting characters from a list of Miyamoto's creations. Miyamoto got the project into production, and a team of less than 10 people cranked out 151 unique monsters for the game, starting with the beetle Pokemon, Pinsir. There were a few touches that Tajiri insisted upon, like giving kids the ability to name their Pokemon so that they could feel more personal. He was also very insistent that Pokemon would never bleed or die in battle, and that he would not put any more pointless violence into the world. The games Pokemon Red and Green enjoyed massive success in Japan, almost single-handedly making the Game Boy system a household name. Soon enough, it was time to take the product overseas. Perhaps unsurprisingly, corporate America was skeptical of the idea. Their concern was that American children simply wouldn't take to the cute monsters that Pokemon was made up of, and requested that they be redesigned to be made tougher looking for the American release. Tajiri refused. A second problem was that due to the fragile source code that made up the games, it would be impossible to translate the existing versions into English, which required them all to be reprogrammed from scratch. This is why the first generation in Japan was Red and Green, while Americans got the somewhat more advanced Red and Blue versions. But despite these setbacks, Pokemon hit America like a hurricane, becoming just as much of a hit as in Japan. But as one of those kids who was caught in the tidal wave that was Pokemon's popularity, what did it mean for me and kids my age? Relatively speaking, I jumped on the Pokemon bandwagon a little late. Heck, I remember kids on the school bus being amazed that I had no idea what an Oddish or a Bellsprout were. And like many kids my age, I wasn't introduced to the series through the games. I was introduced through the anime. And in fact, the only times that I had ever seen the games were watching my neighbors play. When I finally did get the game for Christmas one year, it blew my mind. It was the first real RPG I had ever played, and I thought, and to some extent still think, that the idea of having 151 different characters and being able to catch and customize every single one of them was just astounding. Video games for me up to that point were almost completely linear, and to just be plugged into this open world where I could go anywhere at any time was incredible. I remember walking back from Saffron City to Pallet Town in the middle of the Team Rocket storyline for no other reason than because I could. Pokemon also taught me an important lesson about fiction. Until then, stories were also just linear progression of cause and effect. There's hero goes on journey, beats bad guy, story over. But playing Pokemon, I realized that fiction isn't just about one story, it's about creating a world. Fiction, be it in video games or other media, is not just about the story of a protagonist, well, not the good video games anyway. The realism of any fiction comes not from the protagonist, but from the rest of his world, the people, the stories, the events that have nothing to do with Red or Frodo or Harry Potter. I was taught that was the strength of fiction in any form. But maybe I need to refocus. What did Red and Blue bring to the table? Well, really, they brought everything that was Pokemon. There wasn't a single gameplay mechanic of the original games that isn't present in one way or another in the newer generations. It's truly the mark of something great when all of its core concepts translate today, 20 years later. The story wasn't a whole lot to go on. You play a 10-year-old boy, who you generally named your own name or some kind of dirty word to get a snicker out of your friends, who leaves home to start his Pokemon quest in order to help his neighbor, a renowned Pokemon expert named Professor Oak, fill in his latest invention called the Pokédex, which will create a full description of any Pokemon that you capture. Of course, Professor Oak, being far too old for the job, does the logical thing and sends a pair of 10-year-olds into the wilderness to do it for him. You're given a choice of 3 Pokemon to start out with, a water, grass, or fire type. Your rival, the professor's grandson, will always take the type that your starter is weak against, mostly because he's an a-hole, which coincidentally is what most of us named him. After that, you go off to catch Pokemon. Along the way, you challenge gym leaders who test your strength and face the evil Team Rocket, a gang of Pokemon trainers that use the monsters for crime and money. Enjoy these guys now because they're the only group of bad guys whose motivations make a lick of sense. More on that later. Once you have beaten all the gym leaders and explored all the caves, forests, and roads, you are qualified to face the Pokemon League's Elite Four, the most powerful trainers in the world. It's a long road, but the title of Pokemon Champion awaits you at the end. Now, you might think that I just think this is the perfect game, and while I think it's easily the best franchise any handheld system has ever had, I'd be lying if I said that Red and Blue didn't have their issues. For starters, there wasn't a whole lot of choice when it came to having some types. If you wanted a fire type, you basically either chose Charmander or Vulpix or Growlithe, depending on which version you had. The electric types were pretty sparse as well, but psychic types had to be the worst, with Alakazam being just about your only sensible option. People always joke about Zubat and Rattata being a delightful combination of useless and extremely annoying, and yeah, they really are. You would be ready to hurl your Game Boy out a window around the 1000th time you were stopped in a cave by a Zubat. There are also some highly overpowered moves and types. Yeah, there would be annoying ones later, Roll Out, but Hyper Beam, for example, would basically wipe out absolutely anything it's put up against. And if you manage to catch a Dragonite, oh boy, game's basically over. I also feel like I have to talk about the Missigno glitch, one of the most infamous glitches in gaming history. There are various stories as to why it exists, missing passage of code, Pokemon that were programmed in but never actually finished, but my favorite is the Linkara version, and that Missigno is an ancient elder god that is found only on the shores of Cinnabar, and that by simply looking at it, you gain an infinite number of one item, usually your Master Ball or Rare Candy. Really though, that cheat takes away from the game, and if you use it to get infinite levels, you've basically won at that point already. But really, these problems are small potatoes when one considers how this franchise has changed things. I think that it had a huge impact on our enjoyment of open-world games, and coming out in the 80s and 90s when everything was dark and gritty, it showed that kids were perfectly happy with enjoying something that was fun and colorful, but at the same time we were able to understand something that required a level of strategy and complexity. So is Gen 1 the untouchable, greatest, oh my god you have to love this generation? Well, maybe not. I'm sure there are people who love the later generations because they were the first ones they were exposed to, and they have a level of nostalgic love for it that I have for Red and Blue. I'll never say that a love of any generation is invalid, but are some better or worse than others? Well, we'll talk about that in greater detail in the next installment, Generation 2, Poke Harder!